and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Curtis Brown Creative. If one of your resolutions is to make 2022 the year you start taking your writing seriously, you'll be excited to hear that our sponsors this week are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school affiliated to the major literary agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 150 of their students have gone on to get major book deals, including best-selling authors Jessie Burton, Jane Harper, and Claire Pooley.
CBC offers a wide range of online writing courses led by acclaimed authors, designed to help you no matter what your current skill level is. For people at the start of their writing journey, they have a 4-week Creative Writing for Beginners course led by author and founder of CBC, Anna Davis. The course will teach you to unleash the potential of your imagination. You'll gain the confidence to put pen to paper and get to work on a story of your own creation.
Curtis Brown Creative have provided an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. You can use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of Creative Writing for Beginners or any of their other 4 or 6-week online writing courses. Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and I spoke with the novelist Elif Shafak.
We spoke to Elif about how writing in different languages affects her craft, about the Bastard of Istanbul and her trial in 2006, and about why heavy metal is the perfect music to write to.
As you'll hear, we had a few technical issues while recording this, but it's still a fantastic episode and we hope you enjoy it. Hi Elif, welcome to Always Take Notes and really good to have you on the show. I wanted to start with The Island of Missing Trees, with your new novel. And why was it that you decided you wanted to write about the history of Cyprus?
Oh, thank you so much. I think I've been wanting to write about Cyprus for a very, very long time. But it's not an easy story to tell. So the truth is I could never dare. I've been thinking about it, maybe taking little notes, keeping them to myself, researching, but that's about it. The reason why I couldn't dare is because it's a very complicated story. There's no doubt this is a beautiful island with beautiful people, north and south. But at the same time, it's a place where the past is not a bygone affair. And I think the past is very much alive and breathing within this moment. It's a place where there are lots of untold stories and hurts and grief, a lot of accumulated grief or pain or inherited pain. So how do you tell the story of an island or a land that has experienced partition, ethnic violence, division, without yourself falling into the trap of nationalism, without yourself repeating those codes of tribalism or division? I didn't know how to approach the story. Only when I found the fig tree, only then I found an opening, a gate into the story, and then I could start writing.
And how did you find the voice appropriate for a fig tree as a narrator?
Partly, of course, it was maybe triggered or encouraged by this entire lockdown pandemic period that we have gone through. But I have been thinking about eco-consciousness, ecological awareness, and how to reflect that in the art of storytelling for a while, like many authors, I believe, because we're living at a time of climate emergency and it does shape our every moment. This is not happening in 100 years or 200 years. It is happening right now. But also with the pandemic, I think like many people, I felt the need to reconnect with earth, with trees, even the things that we take for granted, like sitting under a tree and reading a book, the joy of that, you learn to appreciate and you start to perhaps reorder your values, your priorities in life. I'm sure all of that has very much affected the process, but I have been reading about nature, ecology, particularly eco-consciousness, and especially trees and fig trees for quite some time now. And the more I read, the more I'm fascinated by them. I think trees are remarkable and we do have a lot to learn from them.
Could you tell us a bit about your process for creating characters more generally? Do they tend to appear fully formed in your head, or do you work them out in advance, or do they develop on the go? What's your process for that?
Yeah, I think there are two main ways of writing a novel. One of them is a bit like engineering. perhaps a bit more mathematical, perhaps a bit more cerebral, mostly in the brain, in which the author wants to know what's going to happen 5 chapters later, or how the story is going to end, or what the characters are going to do. I respect this path, but it is not my path. I like the second path, in which more than reason and logic and brain, intuition is your guide. So I do write with intuition, but that doesn't mean you don't put any, mind work into it. So what I'm trying to say is my main guide is my heart, is the emotional bond that I have. But other than that, I want to let the characters guide me and the story lead the way. I like it when the story surprises me. I like to be a little bit drunk when I'm writing. I like not knowing what's going to happen in the next chapter. But before I can get into that stage, I do a lot of research, reading, thinking. So there's a lot of cerebral work that goes into that process of getting ready. But once I'm ready to write, it's just intuition, heart, emotion, and just following the flow.
You subscribe to the Ernest Hemingway write drunk, edit sober sort of epithet. You mentioned your research process, and at the end of your novel, you mentioned quite a lengthy bibliography. What's your sort of process there? Did you visit Cyprus at any point while you were writing it?
Not in the year of the throughout the pandemic, but before, yes. And I have always been fascinated by the island. I feel very connected. But also in Turkey, I grew up with lots of stories. I mean, in our family, in the environment that I grew up in, this was a very much alive issue, if I may put it this way. But over the years, particularly in London, but also in different cities, I had the pleasure of meeting lots of Cypriots, lots of islanders, both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, who have shared many stories with me. So I had a chance to also observe immigrant families, and at the heart of the book there is an immigrant family. They have moved from Cyprus to the UK. So that experience of displacement, being uprooted, rerouted, almost deracinated, that was also very important for me.
Could we roll back now to the beginnings of your interest in writing? Is it right that when you were 8 years old, your mother gave you a turquoise notebook because you were constantly speaking with imaginary creatures?
Yeah, I think, in hindsight, I think she was slightly, if not slightly, perhaps more, worried about maybe my mental health. I was an introvert, clearly, but I would chat with invisible creatures around me all the time. I had a very wild imagination, like many children. But I need to tell you that I was a single child. I was an only child raised by a single working mom, and she was away, most of the time during the day. And my grandmother took care of me until the age I was 10 years old. I was born in France. My parents got separated. My father stayed in France, and my mother brought me to Turkey. This was a very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood. So from an early age onwards, I was raised by a grandmother who was a bit of an oral storyteller. And I think all of these things have somehow left an impact on me.
What were some of the early childhood writing experiments about, as well as imaginary creatures?
My grandmother's house was not a house with a huge library or anything. There were a limited number of books. Unlike the first house in Strasbourg in France, which was full of books, this was a house, inhabited mostly by leftist students, immigrants, with big ideas, talking about revolution, smoking gluas, lots of tobacco in the air. That house was full of books. But my grandmother's house, it would have traditional, maybe Muslim folk, culture, that type of books, and limited number of books, and like the story of Layla and Majnun, like the story of, very traditional Middle Eastern stories. And I think what that did to me was, first of all, I longed to read more books, but because there was a limited number of books in that house, I would change the endings of the books, so I would read them again, and I would change their endings. Later on, my mother became a diplomat after I was 11 years old, and she and I traveled quite a bit. That, of course, opened up a whole new literature in front of my eyes. So I started reading in Spanish and in English as well. But when I look back, I realize there are different traditions of storytelling that somehow shaped me, both written culture but also oral culture, both the Western canon of the novel, which I like and love a lot, but at the same time more perhaps Middle Eastern or Eastern, Anatolian ways of storytelling. I respect them too, and I would love my work to bridge these seemingly different worlds.
And when did you first get a desire to write professionally? And how did you make your first steps in that direction?
I started writing fiction at a very early age. I mean, from 8 years onwards. But that's not because I wanted to become a writer. I didn't know such a thing was possible. I had no idea you could dedicate your life to books, that this could be, not because it's not a job we're talking about. It shapes your entire life, day and night. And I didn't know such a thing was possible. But I think my need for books was so deep, so existential, mostly because, as I said, life was very boring, and I thought Storyland was much more interesting, much more colorful, and I wanted to spend more time in that world. The desire to become an author came to me in my early 20s. Ever since I had my first novel published at a relatively young age in Turkey, I knew this was what I wanted to do. But even before that, even deeper, was the need for books. I realized that I have to become a reader. And that's the main thing, isn't it? I think as writers, we need to be readers first and foremost.
Could you tell us a little bit about the process then for that first book, Pinhan? Apologies if I've mangled the pronunciation of that. It went on to win prizes in Turkey, but did you write the whole manuscript and then send it off to an agent and to a publisher? How did it work?
Yes, and it's quite interesting. I realize only in hindsight, because at the time I had no clue, I had no experience in the publishing world. So I wrote this novel and I sent it to one of the leading publishing houses in Turkey. And about a month later, I received an amazing phone call from a very well-known editor, and we had a long chat, which then you realize actually how lucky you are. But at the time, because everything is so new and you don't know how difficult it can be to get published, so in a way you just do it without thinking. But what I can tell you about this book is it surprised many people in Turkey because the language that it uses, I mean, my Turkish, anyone who reads my work in Turkish, I'm hoping they would agree with me, it's quite rich in the sense that I use old words as well as new words. And the reason why this might be important is because in Turkey, we have changed our language over the years. As you know, this was a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire, the Ottoman Empire. So the language...
And the script as well, right? I mean, the script changed.
Correct, yes. But I'm especially focusing on the vocabulary. So the vocabulary, of course, the syntax was Turkish, but there were also lots of words coming from Arabic and Persian, some words from Ladino, from Armenian, from Greek, from Kurdish. So when you Turkify the language, when you take out words, actually, you lose almost half the dictionary. And for a progressive or a modern, whatever you call it, young person to insist on using old words as well as new words was a little bit unusual.
Could you tell us about the influence of Virginia Woolf on you, and in particular Orlando? When did you encounter that book, and what did it speak to you about? It
was, an eye-opening experience. I mean, there are some novels that I have never forgotten. Where was I when I first read it? Because it's almost like a physical experience. When I first read Orlando, and I'm not claiming that I understood the book fully. I was very young. I was in high school, about to finish. But something clicked. Something told me that I didn't know you could write novels like that. I couldn't know you could be so fluid. And maybe I didn't have the word for it, but it spoke to me. It resonated with me very, very deeply. The fact that the writer dares to travel across centuries, across geographies, regions, but also gender boundaries, that kind of fluid world, and the fact that you can do that in a novel, that you keep the canvas so big and the movement so free. I think I would associate Orlando with freedom. So that's, by the time I finished that first reading, that's what stayed with me. I felt free and I longed for that kind of freedom.
And how did your early novels coexist with your work as an academic?
Academia was, I think it's, I stayed in academia for a long time, for many years, doing mostly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. So my background is in international relations, but then I moved to gender studies, gender and women's studies. I was very interested in the theories of feminism, and then I moved to political science, but mostly like political philosophy. That said, I've taught classes in women's studies, in cultural studies, comparative literature. So I've always been interested in learning from different disciplines and how they can contribute to each other. I don't like compartmentalization. I don't like it when people, try to erect walls around knowledge or around different disciplines. Of course, when I say this, I'm aware that the language of academia can be quite different. When you write a paper, it's very different than the language found in fiction. But the way I see it, knowledge is a circle. Everything is interconnected. So I'm interested in knowledge. I'm interested in learning. But at the end of the day, fiction is where my heart beats. So all of that knowledge, I would like it to flow towards fiction, like rivers flowing towards the same sea. But the magnet, the real center for me is the art of storytelling.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the brilliant Elif Shafak. You're about to hear the first of a new segment we're trying out on the podcast. In this segment, you'll hear previous guests of the show answer one of three questions. What's a piece of advice you wish you'd had at the start of your career? When is a time you failed? And what is the most important trait someone in your profession can have? Their answers weren't included in the main interviews that Simon and Rachel did with them, so we're hoping that they'll give you some fresh insight into the careers of some of the fascinating guests that we've had on. To launch this new segment, here's the poet Holly McNish on a piece of advice she wished she'd had at the start of her career.
One piece of advice that I wish I had had at the beginning of my career is not to just do whatever anybody asks you to do. I did a lot of that and a lot of feeling guilty about asking for money for gigs and a lot of free work and a lot of actually losing money paying for trains to get to gigs that people offered me like a cup of tea to do that I didn't need to do. But I genuinely just did because I felt guilty saying no. So it would be to really think before you say yes to everything and try to work out the balance of career development opportunities and working for free or just doing what people want or expect of you.
That was Holly McNish. Now back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Elif Shafak.
Could you tell us about your decision to start writing in English? How you made that and how it went about? I've got a quote here that says, "I still find it easier to express melancholy and longing in Turkish, but humour is definitely easier in English. We don't have a word for irony in Turkish." So how did you take the plunge, and what was your experience of shifting to a different language?
Yes, I think take the plunge is how I would describe it. So I started writing in English first about 15 years ago now. So my earlier novels were all written in Turkish first, and then they were translated. To reverse that process was not a very rational decision. Again, it was more like an animal instinct, I would say, or, definitely irrational, because it's a difficult thing to do. As you can hear in my, voice and the way I speak, I am an immigrant, English is not my native language. I did not grow up in a bilingual house. So for me, this is an acquired language. And as an immigrant, I do know that there will always be a gap between my mind and my tongue. The mind always runs faster, and the tongue is trying to catch up. That gap can be quite frustrating, actually, But if we learn not to be frustrated by that, it can also be inspiring, or it can push you, to pay more attention to words, concepts, idioms, slang maybe the things that sometimes native speakers take for granted, you learn not to take anything for granted when you're an outsider. But basically, I think the reason, now I can say this, the reason why I started writing in English was probably because I felt suffocated and I needed another zone of freedom or of another zone of existence. English gave me that additional space. That said, I'm very attached to the Turkish language. I love my mother tongue. You know, in Turkey, especially nationalists got very upset and they always accuse me of, abandoning my mother tongue. But that's the nationalist mentality. For them, everything is either or. You're either one of us or you're one of them. That is not how I see the world. I think it is possible to dream in more than one language. There are people who, commute between languages in the age of migrations, movements, displacements. And if you can dream in more than one language, you can write fiction in more than one language as well. So it's not abandoning anything. My connection with the Turkish language is very emotional. My connection with the English language is more cerebral. And I think I feel like I need both,
And am I right in thinking that when your books are translated back into Turkish, or translated into Turkish, in fact, someone else does the translation, but you kind of look over it and make corrections?
That is true. And, sometimes people ask, why don't you translate them yourself? I really can't do that. I think it's an amazing talent, literary translation. I do not have that talent. And I have a lot of respect for translators. Really, there are some unsung heroes that make the publishing world, keep going. Definitely translators, definitely booksellers and librarians, people who put so much effort into spreading the love of books, the love of literature, storytelling, but whose names don't get enough credit. And definitely I would call translators among them. So that's the first reason why I don't do it, because I can't do it myself, but also because I would change it probably so much. So when a professional translator finishes the translation, they give me the framework. They give me, the entire manuscript. Within those limits, I can play with the words. As I said, I can use some old words or, the rhythm. I like inverted sentences a lot, in Turkish in particular. So I can do a little bit of play with that, with the structure of the sentences. But the translation is, not my talent.
I just wondered on the language point, had you ever experimented in other languages? Did you learn French as a child then, if you were growing up in France?
I do not speak French because I was very little when I left France, but I do understand very, basic French. That's about it. I do speak Spanish. Spanish actually was my second language. English was my third. But English stayed with me very vividly. It never abandoned me. And I kept writing and reading in this language. Also, writing short stories, but keeping it to myself until I decided to completely, write every novel in English. I always kept it to myself.
But you learned English as an adult, not as a child, or?
I was 11 years old, yeah. Okay. And in Spain. I started learning in English in Spain, in Madrid.
Have you ever written anything in Spanish?
No, that's the thing. And I love the Spanish language. It's such a beautiful language. I love speaking Spanish and hearing people speak Spanish, but I've never written anything in Spanish, which is interesting, So I think from the very beginning, something about the English language, it spoke to me. Now, fast forward, I do appreciate the diversity that exists within the English language so much. When I hear you speak, you use words like chutzpah, or you use words like kismet, and nobody says, wait a minute, that's a Jewish word, the first one, and the second one is an Arabic word. They're not English, let's take them out, whatever that means. But this is the thing that I would hear in terms of taking words out of Turkish language. So all I'm trying to say is all words are welcome and they're part of the language. It's organic flow. And I like that. I really cherish that diversity.
Could you tell us about the publication of The Bastard of Istanbul and in 2006 and then the series of events that followed that? So you were accused of insulting Turkishness, is that right?
Yes, I was accused of insulting Turkishness because we have an article in the Turkish Constitution, Article 301, which protects Turkishness against insults, but nobody knows what that means. And because it's so vague, it's open to all kinds of misinterpretation. So when the novel was published, The Bastard of Istanbul tells the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family, generations of women. And it is a book that talks about memory and amnesia, and it talks about the Armenian genocide, which is a very big taboo in Turkey to this day. When the book was published, I had an amazing, heartwarming response from the readers. But at the same time, from the authorities, it was a completely different story. So I was put on trial under Article 301, which was quite unexpected because that same article has been used against historians, against journalists, against non-fiction writers, but never before against a fiction writer. So it was quite surreal in the sense that sentences from the book were plucked, taken out of the book and used as evidence in the courtroom, which means that my Turkish lawyer had to defend the words of my Armenian fictional characters in the courtroom. And that went on for about a year. There were groups on the streets, ultra-nationalist, nationalist groups spitting out my pictures, burning EU flags. It was quite unnerving that year. And after a year of trial, I was acquitted.
Yeah, that was sort of my question of what that experience was like for you, emotionally and financially. Was it incredibly costly?
Emotionally, I think I would say it was unnerving, also because I was pregnant at the time, and the way it happened, the day before I was acquitted and the next day I gave birth. So the entire year was a very unusual year. But even after that, I had to have a bodyguard for a year and a half for writing a work of fiction. So, of course, at the time you don't realize how it affects you, but over the years, definitely, I found it very unsettling, the whole experience. But that said, when I write fiction, when I'm in the middle of a novel, I really try to forget this so-called real world, and I try to remain in my imaginary world as best as I can, as much as I can, because if you start worrying about what people are going to say, you really can't write,
What is the reception of your work in Turkey today, do you think? Is it right that in 2019 a Turkish prosecutor again examined your novels, so The Gaze and Three Daughters of Eve? How does your interaction with the government work now?
Of course, Turkey is a very complex country. It's incredibly complicated, and over the years it has been going backwards, at first gradually, but then with a bewildering speed. And I think it declined more and more into nationalism, but also fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, also populist authoritarianism. The loss of democracy, in my opinion, went hand in hand with the rise in sexism, homophobia, and misogyny. I don't think these things are coincidental, they feed each other. So all I'm trying to say is, of course, many people recognize that it is difficult to write about political issues in Turkey, but sometimes people don't realize that it can be equally challenging to write about sexuality, to question gender norms, gender codes. That too can be a challenge for a writer. And in 2019, my books have been, police officers came to my Turkish publishing house and they collected some of my books alongside the books by a feminist author called Duygu Asena. She was a very well-known, iconic feminist writer in Turkey whose work I respect a lot. Her books have been taken as well to the prosecutor's office, even though she's dead, right, So all I'm trying to say is it's quite surreal, this whole thing. And they have launched an investigation to see if there was any crime of obscenity in it.
Given the popularity of your work amongst Turkish readers, presumably this sort of interference from the government has not deterred Turkish publishing houses from taking on your work and publishing it there.
It's again, I would say it's complicated because it has affected the publishing industry, the loss of democracy. So I don't want to personalize everything, because in general I think Turkey can be difficult for anyone who deals with words. if you're a writer, a poet, a journalist, life is not easy. I think, being a Turkish novelist is not easy, but being a maybe Turkish women novelist can be additionally hard because there's an extra layer of sexism that you have to deal with. But also, for instance, the life of a cartoonist is not easy in Turkey at all. I think doing humor, I have so much respect for humor, particularly compassionate humor. I think humor is so healthy and is such an essential part of democracy. To be able to make fun of people in power, the humor allowed in public spaces, that's one of the first things that gets lost when democracy is shattered.
And you've referred to Turkey's collective amnesia in interviews before, and you've talked about writers who bear witness to silences and to the silence. Do you feel a responsibility as a novelist to redress that and to bear witness to those silences?
I think memory is a responsibility, not in order to get stuck in the past or revive old animosities, of course not, but to learn from the past, to understand, and to be able to talk about the past in a calm and nuanced way so that we can build a better future together. I do believe in that. But also I think personally, I also believe that stories, of course, as storytellers, we are drawn to stories, we love stories, but I think we're equally drawn to silences. I mean, I know that I am. So maybe I can tell you that in my writing, there's a desire to give more voice to people who have been pushed to the periphery, the margins, anyone who feels marginalized, disempowered for any reason. I want to understand their story and I want to bring the periphery to the center, try to make the invisible a little bit more visible, maybe try to make the unheard a bit more heard. And I think in that sense, literature does swim against the current, does try to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. To me, that's important. And I also think if you happen to come from a wounded democracy like Turkey, if you happen to be a novelist from such a place, you don't have the luxury of being apolitical. You can't say, I only want to write about or talk about my fiction and about nothing else when so much is happening outside the window. I think many minority authors in the Western world also feel this urgency to speak up about racism, hate speech, hate crimes. So there are these core issues, fundamental issues that you feel the need to speak about. On the other hand, I need to tell you that I am a feminist and, as you know, one of the many wonderful things that feminism opened up as a debate is about what is politics? Is it only what political parties and politicians do? Is it something more broad and complex and subtle? So wherever there's inequality, wherever there's power relationship, there is politics, and the personal is also political. So you might be writing about marriage and gender and sexuality or whatever. That too can be actually quite political.
And how do you avoid making those themes come through in a sort of didactic manner? How do you keep that? How do you avoid a novel turning into a sort of lecture?
I really think this is an important question. And the way I see it, I make a distinction between asking questions and trying to give answers. I don't think it's a writer's job to answer or to offer their answers. Actually, I don't like that. I don't like it at all when writers try to teach something or preach something. Again, I come from a country in which there is a solid tradition of father novelists. The novel came to Turkey, late Ottoman era, from continental Europe mostly. And we have a very long and solid tradition of novelists who saw themselves as the fathers of their readers and try to teach their readers something. I've never felt close to that tradition. I don't know the answers myself. So what I believe in is the questions, the freedom to ask the questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues. And I think in a novel, that's why I love that large canvas so much, you can hear a plurality, a multiplicity of voices and opinions, and put yourself in the shoes of another person, acquire a cognitive flexibility that is constantly denied to us in our daily lives, and we are intellectual nomads, you know. So I love that diversity of opinions that a novel can nurture. And at the end, you have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader will come up with their own answers, and I have to respect that. No two people read the same book in the same way. I have met, you know, couples who have been married for 45 years, they read the same book, they don't read it in the same way. Best friends, one of them loves the book, the other one not so much. Why? Because every reader brings their own gaze, their own story into the story. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So I am just following the questions, but not trying to dictate any answers, and I don't like that.
A message from our sponsor, Writing Magazine. Alongside their monthly magazine, Writing Magazine hosts creative writing courses that offer aspiring and published writers something very special. Have you always wanted to improve your writing or break into a new genre? They can tailor their creative writing courses to suit your experience and ambitions.
All of their tutors are successful published writers, trained to bring out the best in your writing abilities and help you succeed in your chosen genre. Your personal tutor will build on your existing knowledge and help you to develop your writing through valuable one-to-one feedback and advice in constructive critiques.
Writing Magazine are offering our podcast listeners 20% off any of their courses throughout the whole of December and January. To claim your discount, simply email writingcourses@warnersgroup.co.uk with the code podcast20 and the course you'd like to enrol on. For full course details, visit their website www.writers-online.co.uk/writing-courses. Could we talk now about 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, which you published in 2019 to great acclaim, told from the perspective of Layla, a murdered sex worker. How did you get the idea for that story?
You know, there were two things that started the entire novel. The one comes from neuroscience. I became very interested in these studies that show after the moment of death, after the human heart has stopped beating, the brain can remain active for another few minutes, sometimes up to 10 minutes. And that to me was quite interesting and, you know, an amazing puzzle. What happens inside the human mind in that limited amount of time? And if it is true that the dead remember, and if it is true that the part of our brain that is in touch with long-term memory is the last bit to shut down, then what do the dead remember? You know, the good things or the bad things? In a way, that gave me the structure of the entire novel. But also, if I may add this very quickly, there's an actual place in Istanbul, there's an actual graveyard that very much shaped this book. It's called the Cemetery of the Companionless. That's how I would translate it. People who don't have a companion, people who don't have anyone in life. And I became very drawn to this place. Years and years ago, I started doing research. And the reason why you have to do research is because there's no information whatsoever. There are no tombstones, no marble tombstones, no visitors, nothing. There's just wooden placards with numbers scribbled on them. And when the numbers disappear under the rain or snow, everything disappears. You have no way of knowing who's buried there. And then you realize, of course, that the people who are taken there have been shunned, rejected by their families, by their communities. There are many people who have died of AIDS-related illnesses, especially in 1980s and 90s, because of the stigma of HIV. They have been buried there, almost dumped there. There are people who come from LGBTQ plus communities. They have been rejected and buried there. There are some sex workers there buried. There are abandoned babies, suicides, and also a growing number of refugees. So it's a very sad and strange place where an Afghan refugee might be buried next to a Kurdish sex worker or an abandoned baby. And I think my instinct as a writer was to try to reverse the process, because it's a place where human beings are turned into numbers. I wanted to take one of those numbers and gave that number a story, try to rehumanize and reverse the process.
Elif, could you tell us a bit about your writing process more generally and your routine? Is it right that you listen to heavy metal on repeat and that you hate silence?
That is true. I don't like silence at all. And I feel very nervous if I'm in an extremely, quiet and tidy and neat place. I just feel very awkward. I feel like I don't, I just want to leave that place. So maybe also because I lived so many years in Istanbul for so long, and I love the sounds of the city. Istanbul is a very noisy city, one of the noisiest across the world. And where I lived in particular was even, there was more noise during nighttime than during the day. And I like that, I would open the windows and listen to all the swearing and shouting and yelling, this anger, restlessness of the city. But with regards to heavy metal, I've been a metalhead or a heavy metal fan since my early youth. People find it odd that a middle-aged Turkish mother might be listening to heavy metal, but I've always loved that type of music, especially subgenres, of heavy metal, like progressive, symphonic, folk, Viking, metalcore. I love its high energy, and I can listen to the same song on repeat 70, 80 times, and that really, really helps me to concentrate.
That's amazing, and definitely a first for the podcast. And in terms of the routine, do you write within certain hours, and do you work consistently over a period until you get it finished, or do you kind of work in fits and starts?
Yeah, I think there's no such thing as a exact, precise schedule. And I'm always amazed when I hear some authors, it's usually male authors of a certain age, who are very fond of a very precise schedule. They know every day when to start, when to go out for a walk and come back. But I think for all the rest of us, it's you juggling, as parents, as people who do many things, you try to carve out a zone, a time for yourself. And people like Toni Morrison, they have left, I think, a big impact on me. She was a single mom, she was an editor, and I've always, as a novelist, as a public intellectual, she's someone I always respected a lot. And in one of her essays, she describes how sometimes she writes during the day and during the night. And I would say my process is very similar as well. What I do make sure of, however, is that every day I read. So it doesn't mean that every day I write, but every day I make sure I read, whether it's in the morning, during the afternoon, and I take notes. So it really depends. My working hours really depend on the flow of the day. But all I can tell you is I have a pendulum. When I'm inside a novel, that really becomes almost the center of my life. That really becomes, everything is shaped, flows around the story. And when the novel is over, when I hand it to my editor, I think the pendulum swings to the other end. And I try to do other things, just learn other things, like learn how to bake bread, listen to the universe. So I don't immediately start a new novel as soon as I've finished one. I try to listen to what the universe is telling me.
Could we come back to this idea you touched on earlier about the two ways of writing a novel, so the engineering approach versus the kind of intuition approach? Because this is something that comes up repeatedly on the podcast, and we always ask novelists about it. And as you say, there do seem to be a complete variance of approaches, from people who work out the plot fully to those who plunge in. Have you always done that, or have you ever kind of toyed with other methods and other ways of doing it? And how did you kind of come to work in that very intuition-led way?
I have always done that because maybe it's also my personality. I like to listen to my intuition. I like to listen to my own emotions. I like to be in touch with emotions. However, there's also a part of me that is more cerebral, and maybe that's the part that comes from academia, or years of experience in academia maybe gave me a sense of discipline that I otherwise lacked. For me to be able to follow my intuition, I really need to know the ground first. So I can fly, but first I need to feel the solid ground beneath my feet. And that means there's a long process of preparation, getting ready, taking notes. I read everything and anything I can find on this subject. And sometimes, like with the Island of Missing Trees, you read about butterflies and about, bees and figs and different types of trees. every single detail. If it's historical fiction, what would they wear? You have to immerse yourself in a lot of research. But once that is over, I think then you fly, you take off.
How long, in sort of terms of months, is the research process versus the writing process?
It really depends. Sometimes research actually takes much longer than we realize. Like with this book, I have been thinking about Cyprus, taking notes about Cyprus, listening, but not quite knowing one day it would turn into a novel. So there isn't a precise beginning actually with research. But if I may put it this way, I think we have to be learners in life, you know. Writers need to be, of course, good readers, but also good listeners. Just keep curiosity alive, almost a childish curiosity. Just say, why is it like that? You know, where does this name come from? What is this street named after so and so? What's the story behind it? And in a place like Istanbul, where there's a lot of urban amnesia, you know, you can pass by an old building. There's no placard. It's just abandoned, dilapidated. What happened? What happened to the family who was living there? What happened on the streets? You have no way of knowing, so you have to start digging yourself as a writer. You have to, excavate into that cultural heritage. All I'm saying is curiosity is a big part of this, and be open to learning from multiple disciplines. Sometimes when people say to me, I don't read fiction, so much is happening in the world. My wife reads fiction, I read politics, history, philosophy. I feel sad because I think inside fiction there is everything. There is history, there is philosophy, there is psychology and politics. But most importantly, I think we should read across the board, fiction and non-fiction, East and West. So if we always read the same type of books, actually we're not learning, we're not opening ourselves to learning from others. That's why I like eclectic reading lists.
And what is the editing process like with your books? Do you try and file a kind of polished draft before anyone sees it, or is there a lot of back and forth? And how has that developed as your career has progressed?
Editing is a big part of this. And sometimes, when we talk about creative writing, we tend to think of it as, adding a layer upon layer every day. People say, how many words have you written today? But nobody asks, how many words have you deleted today? Have you erased today? But that too is part of the process. So it's not like every day you add 5 pages, 20,000 words, whatever. And there are moments when you stop and you take out chunks of your writing, you let go. And I think that is the hardest bit about the creative writing process, letting go. Because you put so much effort and faith and love. You believed in those pages, but now they don't work. So editing, destroying what you have written, not only constructing, but sometimes destroying too, is part of the process. And I think also I have learned over the years that there are times when you feel anxious, lots of self-doubt, and there are times when you feel like, okay, this is working, this is going well. That too, the highs and lows, is too, I think, a part and parcel of the writing journey.
How is your experience of writing non-fiction compared with writing fiction? You've published The Happiness of Blonde People in 2011 and How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division in 2020. Do you have a medium that you prefer writing in or that you find easier to write?
For me, fiction will always be the heart, at the center. I like non-fiction as well, especially at certain stages in your life, like manifestos, when you have something special to say. And I think there are things I want to share with readers via a different medium. So I'm open to the idea of non-fiction essays, thinking about maybe the theory, the craft, maybe not theory, but craft of writing, not only the art. I like thinking about literary criticism or ideas. There's a part of me that really enjoys that. But at the end of the day, as I said, it all goes back to the world of fiction. So as a friend to my fiction, I like my own non-fiction, but not at the heart, not at the center.
So it's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and people's writing lives and how the two have interacted. So be as candid or as guarded as you want. But for yourself, as you built your career and you were in academia and then writing professionally, how have you made it work financially, and how did that side develop?
For a very long time, it was very difficult, and I think that was one of the reasons why I stayed in academia. Of course, the main reason was I really enjoyed learning and discovering, but there are times when academia can feel repetitive. And the reason why I stayed for so long, one of the reasons, was because financially I could not make a living just out of writing fiction. That was impossible, unthinkable. It accumulated. So for me, sometimes, people look at a book and they think, oh, if it's successful, they think it was always so. But I think it's such a gradual process, bit by bit, book by book, chapter by chapter. That's how I experienced it. So it didn't really happen with one book or with one title. But over the years, I would say it's an accumulation. So for many years, I could not make a living out of my writing. But over the years, slowly it grew. And then there came a moment when I left academia, and now I solely earn from fiction.
How have prizes played a role in that? You've quipped in the past that authors that don't care about prizes are sort of deluding themselves. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't believe anyone who says, I don't care about whether my books are being read or liked by readers. Of course we care. And I think we should honestly talk about this, which doesn't mean you write because you dream of a prize. Of course not. You write because you believe in what you're doing. You write because you love the art of storytelling, for sure. But it can be a very good thing for an author, maybe sometimes like a morale boost. And if I may add this, people think only young writers need this kind of boost. I think writers in all age groups, in all stages of their life, because of these doubts and anxieties and depressions that there are valleys of depression, mountains of anxiety that we all have to traverse when we are writing a novel. And because it's such a solitary task, you have no idea if anyone is going to connect with what you're doing. But you have to have that faith. So for weeks, for months, sometimes for years, you're in that solitary world. We don't do teamwork. And you have to have faith in your novel. And when the book is published, if someone writes you a letter and says, I read your book and it meant so much to me, it touched something in my soul, it touched a chord in my soul, that is precious. And in that regard, I think that kind of recognition that comes from prizes can make authors and does make authors happy. That's why I'm not criticizing prizes, but I wish there were more prizes in a much more diverse way, and also bringing on board writers who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, from minority backgrounds, whose voices are not heard enough in the publishing world. I think there are lots of inequalities in the publishing world that we need to be aware of.
Is it right that you also write lyrics, and particularly lyrics for rock bands?
I wish I could say, it's something I keep doing, but I've, written a few song lyrics in the past, but that's about it. And I love it. I love song lyrics. It's for me it's incredibly important. If I want to connect with a song, the lyrics are the main thing.
Even with heavy metal.
Even with heavy metal, yes, the lyrics matter.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so just a final question from me. What's next? Are you working on another novel already, or are you giving it a bit of a break before you dive back in again?
Yeah, I think right now I'm reading and listening, just thinking. I'm in that stage when I'm just thinking.
Brilliant. Well, look, Elif, thank you for being a fantastic guest on Always Take Notes, and wishing you all the best with your work going forward.
This was such a pleasure for me. Thank you so much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Elif Shafak. She's on Twitter at Elif_Shafak, that's spelled Safak in the Turkish manner. Her latest book is The Island of Missing Trees, which was published in 2021 by Penguin. A message from our sponsor, Vitsu, Melvin's story.
We love, love, love our Vitsu shelving. Build quality and ease of assembly is amazing, but it was your service that made the whole process such a joy.
So said Melvin from Sydney in this heartfelt message to his Vitsu planner Sophie in London. Love is a word heard a lot at Vitsu. Other verbs just don't seem to cut it. As with any customer, Sophie considered every detail, so Melvin's bookshelves were perfect for his needs. Passionate about good service, she communicates with all her customers directly, wherever they are in the world. Whether in person or on the other side of the globe, Vitsu's planners hold your hand throughout the process, time and again proving that long-distance relationships really do work. Every interaction is handled with love from Vitsu.
Vitsu's 606 Universal Shelving System is a modular, adaptable kit of parts. It can provide the perfect home for your books, and even the desk from which to write one. Visit vitsu.com, that's vitsoe.com, or request a free brochure via email at vitsu.com by quoting ATN 606.
Vitsu, makers of long-living furniture by Dieter Rams. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Elif?
When we spoke to Elif, she was sat in front of the most amazing wall of books. And I liked that she mentioned in the interview her method of reading very widely while she's sort of collecting ideas for her novels. And I think the fruits of that approach are really evident in The Island of Missing Trees, which references a huge range of sort of mythical folklore, history, everything. So I enjoyed picking her brains, and she was a long muted guest on the show, so it was great. What about you?
My abiding memory, I hate to say, is the mortification of vanishing in the middle of the conversation as my internet connection collapsed. But both Rachel and Elif herself seemed to take this completely in their stride and seemed to be having a very nice time when I finally emerged some minutes later. So it definitely was
striking out on my own, Simon. I
know.
Want to tell you.
It was testing Rachel's new solo project. It was testing the edges of our technical envelope, but she was extremely charming, and as Rachel alluded to, she's someone we've wanted to have on the show for a while, a huge name, and also the fact that she's had these battles with the authorities and with suppression of her work in Turkey, I also thought was very impressive. And I suppose too the fact that this multilingual approach, which as with other writers, as with Nabokov, I always find that the fact that if someone can write fiction in a second or even a third language, it's a remarkable achievement. So, yeah, from my perspective, really great to have her on the show. Rachel, what have you been up to as we welcome in 2022?
Well, we've both had a little break over Christmas, which was very nice and much needed. I've just been doing lots of reading. I've just finished a book review of a book that's come out this month called School for Good Mothers. So that will be coming out in the next week or so. Beyond that, I can't think of anything. How about you?
I also had some time off over Christmas, which was really good and required. I've been picking things up at the beginning of the year, just trying to wrap up this book proposal I'm working on, and then moving forward with magazine stuff, and then the usual kind of freelancer January admin of getting my taxes done and things like that. So yeah, looking forward to the new year and all the great guests that we've got coming up on the podcast. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.